Okay, one final thing I want to talk about this week about fiction is point of view. For me, point of view is, as I say here, the central apparatus for fiction to happen. If you think it's sort of like the way, like what canvas is, the canvas is to painting, or what the staff is to music, or like harmony, right? It's the way that fiction has an effect on its audience. If the goal for you as a fiction writer is to take your reader and give them this story to kind of engage in for a while, to point them towards certain truths, that act of engagement can happen only through point of view, only through the sort of dropping them into some specific consciousness that's not their own. This is the other way that fiction is very important, because that takes an act of empathy, right? I, as a reader, need to feel what it's like to be this other person. And then that's, if you can get readers, if you can practice that, you can use that in real life, right? And become just like smarter, better people. If the world read a novel a week, we would have no wars. I believe this fully, but it's probably total BS. But anyway, that's what's key about point of view. So you have the options, right? And you probably know all of these already, but just to go over them quickly. The first person is one option, and that's where the narrator narrates herself, right? So the whole point of this is like, I am the person involved in this story. So this is sort of about me, this is about my life, and that narrator and character gets kind of conflated. Okay, and then the next one is sort of weirder. Well, let me go back to the first person for a second, and just sort of say, because of this, right, and because no person, real or imagined, has a perfect grasp on their own existence or consciousness, right? They can't look at their own lives objectively. We just can't do this because we're involved. We are ourselves. Every first-person narrator is inherently an unreliable narrator. So much of the story is about like what is the larger story outside of this one person's point of view. Next is the second person point of view, where the narrator narrates the reader, right? So whoever is reading your story becomes the main figure, the main character in the story. You are the person involved in the story. It's newer, it's experimental, it has some readers, it's so intimate, right? It's this forced intimacy into the story that some readers will kind of be taken aback by it. It's good if you think that your reader will not engage in the story given its content or its form or what have you, to then bridge that gap by just dropping them in and using the second person. Once you start it, you have to be consistent. That's the case for all of these, of course. Consistency. I'll type it here. Consistency. Don't change point of view. In a novel, you can get away with it. In a story, there's just not enough time. You'll find stories that break that rule, but for now, consider it a rule that you can't break. But particularly with the second person, it always has to be you. As soon as you sort of say I, then you're into the first person. Or like he or she, you can have other characters, but if they start to take over, then what's the reader doing in the story? Finally, the third person, the narrator narrates someone else. So what's good about this is that there's a high level of trust on the part of the reader and the narrator. Because it's like the reader and the narrator over here, and they're like, hey, let's talk about this story. And here are the people over there that are doing everything. And you and I can have this conversation about what's happening, right? So there's a different kind of intimacy that happens there. When we're talking like she is involved in the story, let's talk about her. Like, let me tell you what's going on in her head. It's not me. It's not you. We can relax. Okay, so that's traditionally the most used, but in the 20th century, the first person. Well, that's not necessarily true. People were using the first person well before the 20th century, but as consciousness and psychology has been a key concern, and not so much society or the world at large, the first person has become a kind of dominant mode. You can choose among any of them. How do you choose? Ask yourself some questions. First, who changes, or whom do the events mostly affect? This is a way to figure out who is the protagonist of your story, who needs to solve their own problems, resolve the conflict, etc. That person's often the point of view you should use. First person, third person, what have you. The person is up to you, but the point of view could be that person. But it need not be, right? Who needs to understand what happened? If you've read The Great Gatsby, that's about the life of Jay Gatsby. He's our protagonist in a lot of ways. But it's Nick Carraway, the sort of newcomer on the scene, who needs to understand what Jay Gatsby's life means, needs to understand how this culture and the society of the 1920s New York operates. So he's the one who narrates in the first person. Also with Faulkner, right? You'll see in A Rose for Emily. Emily is our heroine, whatever. She's our protagonist, but it's the townspeople who need to understand her story, and so they're the ones who narrate. And then finally ask yourself, who can tell what happened? Basically, who is present, right? Who is still alive? You don't want to start telling a story and then you just sort of leap and there's a scene where your narrator isn't at all present. Suddenly you've got a problem. Okay. So we'll talk more about this on Tuesday. For Tuesday read, so you've got A Rose Family by William Faulkner, a very, very famous short story, and also A.M. Holmes' more recent story called Do Not Disturb. Read both of them, and just as we said before, conflicts, that's also the heart of fiction. Figure out what the conflicts are, but also figure out what points of view those authors have chosen and why those points of view are right for each of them. Okay, because they could have gone another way, and how would that change the story that you're reading? Also, try to figure out what the themes are. What are these stories saying about their subjects, and where specifically in the story are these themes being developed? Okay, that's 12 minutes, 25 seconds, too long, but I'm sorry. Yeah, have a good day.